Just for our stream to load and we'll be good to go. I'll give you a go.
Thank you very much.
All right, we are live.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to, I think, our second, at least while I've been chair of the committee, February 3rd virtual meeting. I'd like to welcome everyone to the group. We don't have to do a full quorum or chat right now. We're gonna have a chance to introduce ourselves. We'll make sure that we go round robin for a moment. But has everyone had a chance to review the January 6th minutes? If so, I will accept the motion to approve.
So move.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stacy. All right, all in favor, and I think we can do both thumbs up and ayes.
Aye.
Right, and I'm clicking through. I've seen the plurality of people with thumbs up. 2 thumbs up from Commissioner Horton. Great. Great. So we'll go ahead and approve those. Thank y'all. I will have the pleasure of being rather short today. We'll skip old business. We have none. Jump right into the new business section because I'm very excited and honored that we have a guest here today. And I think this is the first solo guest that we've ever had presenting to us to share some wisdom about a book that we've discussed before, The Daycare Myth. I am 80% of the way through it. It is compelling, and it's the first time in a while that I'm reading a book that does not depress me about some of this. So I'm really excited about having a forward-looking perspective on a otherwise very challenging time in early childhood funding and how we're framing this conversation. To share with you all a little bit of background, I'm going to brag on Dr. Warrior for a minute. So thrilled to welcome him today. He's a nationally recognized leader in early childhood education with more than 30 years experience, spanning from classroom teaching, state policy leadership, national advocacy. He's the founder of the Early Childhood Policy Solutions and previously served as Senior Director of Early Learning at the Hunt Institute of North Carolina, where he helped shape the early childhood policy nationwide. He's also the author of the acclaimed book, The Daycare Myth, which some of us have already read, which challenges a lot of the common misconceptions and offers some actionable insights for improving early learning systems. And I think that is kind of the impetus for why we're so lucky to have him, that we have been trying to figure out how do we deploy our funds effectively? What are we doing to create some movement in this space? Obviously, we can complain about having more money every day of the week. That's the nature of government. But what are we doing specifically in this space that might move the needle for the kiddos, for our next generation, and our economy? Because we're starting to understand better that this is not just something that's framed through the lens of education, but something that is much bigger, wider spread impact on our entire country in a multitude of ways. So I'd like to go ahead and please join me in welcoming Dr. Dan Worry. And before I pass the mic formally over to him, I just wanted to go ahead and introduce very quickly our committee. If people don't mind going around, please don't give a 3-minute bio. I know you all have 2 pages worth of resume, but if you can just share who you are really quick and maybe what you do to kind of indicate the diverse group that we have here and kind of set the stage for whatever questions may come up with Dr. Worry and understanding his role. So I'll go ahead and start. I'm Martin Moore. I'm an attorney, county commissioner, and the Early Childhood Education Committee chair. And the next person on my screen, Stacy, I'm just going to pass it to you because you are right front and center for me.
That'll be fun. Hi, this is Stacy Anderson, and full disclosure, Dan and I worked together many years ago when he was deputy director at First Steps in South Carolina. So we have a long history, and I've watched his career blossom over the years. And this book, I think, is it really nails a lot of the things that we need to be aware of. Policy change is going to be the hardest thing we ever have to do. So there we go.
And Stacy, if you can just name someone next up, we'll keep the ball
Beth.
rolling.
Hello, I'm Beth Sherman. A mother of 5, 4 girls, 1 boy. The youngest is 18, so I've made it through the daycare part. I'm also a former child care center director in Franklin, Tennessee, which is south of Nashville. And I did that for many years before changing over to medical. But now I am a survivor of corporate healthcare of 15 years. But that's me. And Al, you get to go next.
Oh, thanks. Hi, I'm Al Whitesides. I'm a retired banker. I've been on the County Board of Commission. I'm in my 10th year now, and I'm one of the three commissioners that were the initial members of this committee when it started. Uh, I long since been with child care. My older daughter will be 60 years old in a few days, so you know. And I have grown grandchildren, but I've been concerned about early child care since my kids were small. Commissioner Horton, I understand she's on. I'll call you next.
Good morning. My name is Jennifer Horton. I'm a Buncombe County Commissioner. I am a registered nurse, an administrator for people with mental illness and disabled and family care homes. I'm the mother of 6, ages ranging from 19 to 1 year. I've been a foster parent, both licensed and unlicensed in Buncombe County for the last, 16, 17 years. So 3 of those babies are my blessing babies. I didn't birth them, but they are mine. But yeah, and I will pass it to Angeline because she is smiling so big.
Hey, so I'm Angeline Johnson. I am on staff here at the county and immigrants manager who supports early childhood here in strategic partnerships. And I will pass to Maya.
Hi, I'm Maya Sloan. I have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old in Asheville City Schools, so we just wrapped up with the preschool world. And I have worked within Asheville City Schools for the past 15 years, mainly in the elementary schools. So like I've kind of been focusing in on how preschools can support early learners in kindergarten and first grade. And I will pass to Joe.
Thanks, Maya. Afternoon, everyone. Joe Jameson, United for Youth Senior Director. We are a cradle to career place-based partnership based out of the United Way of Asheville and Buncombe County here. So I'm sitting in the funder seat on this committee and also a parent of a 4 and 7-year-old. And I will pass to Sarah.
Hey, I'm gonna choose. Oh wait, there's 2 Sarahs.
No, there's always more than one. Go ahead, Sarah.
That's children of the 80s. There's a lot of Sarahs. But I am Sarah LePay. I am a mother of 2, an 11 and 13-year-old. So in a different phase of childcare, not an early childcare, but still a big part of life. And I am a general pediatrician in the community here. And I will pass it to the other Sarah.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Sarah Gaborik. I am a policy researcher actually in early care and education in K-12, and I'm a former K-12 teacher. Heather.
Hi there. I am a parent of adult children now, so through that phase of life, and I work here at Mayheck Family Health Center as a therapist and faculty member, so teaching our resident physicians. I specialize in infant and young child mental health for more than 20 years, and I've always worked in public mental health and public health. And I've had the privilege to work with many early childhood education centers, including providing teachers, therapy, but also site-based mental health services in classroom settings. I think I was the last. Did I leave anybody out, y'all? Oh, Emily, sorry.
I think Carol as well. Hi, I'm Emily Nicholson. I am a member of this committee, and I'm so grateful for that because I represent this on a personal and professional front. On a personal level, I'm a mom of 3 daughters, ages 13, 9, and 6. And I'm also a former K-12 teacher as well. So on a professional level, I have the honor of representing sort of an educational part of the shop at Land of Sky Regional Council, where our early childhood advocacy has really been uplifted by Buncombe County, and we're really grateful for that because we know these issues are going to require some major shifts at sort of a statewide and federal level. So I think when that collective advocacy happens, we can turn some heads. So yeah, I'll pass it, I think, to Carol.
Hey everyone, Carol Steen, Vice President of HR, IT, and Security for Biltmore Farms. And I am a parent of twin 11-year-olds, and I've been advocating for resources for childcare in the community for just about that long.
And I'll round us out with a quick introduction. Rachel Sawyer, here in the capacity of local government administrator as the point person for strategic partnerships, where the early childhood funding resides within Buncombe County government. And the person that got a wild hair and reached out to Dr. Dan Worry and said, hey, we've been reading your book. I see you've got a consulting service. How about coming and connecting with our committee and helping us through this project? So this may be the start of additional work that we are able to do at the committee level. I want to share great news that Dan has agreed to support staff as we help carry out the project plan related to focused investments. Very timely for us to hear from you. And so we will hand you the floor, Dan, and take as little or as much time as works for you. We'll be glad to have some questions and discussion if there's time at the end. And we do have public comment as part of this meeting, so we'll build in a little time for that. And then Martin will wrap us up later with some announcements. The floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Wow, Rachel, thank you, and committee members, thank you. It is such a treat to be with you. I have to tell you how delighted I was when Rachel did reach out and initiated this conversation and said that some of you had been looking at the book, and would I be interested in possibly helping to support the committee's work? But I'm always thrilled when any community has decided to really commit to focusing on the needs of young children. But I have to tell you, I'm particularly partial to Buncombe County, and I think I associate it very much with the early childhood of my own children. I live in Columbia, South Carolina, but Asheville is a very special place. Western North Carolina, a very special place to our family. It is a place that we visited many, many, many times, particularly during my children's youth. I now have two young adults, but I just as to establish a little bit of street cred, my children, I think for 5 or 6 years running, were the Halloween costume champions at the Western North Carolina Nature Center every year. About it's been probably 15, 20 years ago now. But Asheville and Buncombe County have a very special place for me. So I'm thrilled to be able to do this, and very sorry that we aren't able to be together in person. It is unusual we had almost 8 inches of snow at my house in Columbia. It's been years since we had any sort of appreciable snow. So you have to appreciate how South Carolina closes down when even a flurry of snow arrives. So I'm going to start pulling up my slides here, but I have been really thrilled to spend much of the past year. Let's see if I can get these. Hang on, let me get us started here. Okay. There we go. Have spent much of the past year traveling around not only the United States, but the world. I visited 6 countries last year, speaking a little bit about this little book that it's interesting. It's very American in its focus, but was fascinating to find, and has been fascinating to know just how much the rest of the world shares a lot of our problems, maybe even places that you might perceive to be well ahead of us. So this book, The Daycare Myth, is really at a broad level about the disconnect between what we know from the science of early childhood and what we do when it comes to our policy. And I'm going to begin you, and Frank, let me give you a little bit of a disclaimer here before we get started. The book is very much focused on policy. Today, I'm going to spend probably a little bit more time talking about the what and the why of early childhood, more so than the how, which I think we can, we have the rest of the year to talk about. But I'm hopeful that maybe this part of the book will help you to maybe think a little bit differently about some of the issues that are being faced. And so I'll share some fun baby videos. You'll have a good time, I hope. I'm going to start you in a place that is maybe kind of an unusual place. Those of you who have read the book know that this begins us on the very first page, and I open the book, and I open today in this place for a reason that will be apparent in just a minute. But I want to talk a little bit about the food pyramid. I don't know how many of you remember the food pyramid. It's a little bit depressing. I've started asking in some of my keynotes because the food pyramid. I think of my references as being very recent. My young adult children are fond of telling me that they're not so much anymore. The food pyramid was now 34 years ago. So I've started asking people to raise their hand if they weren't born in 1992 when the food pyramid was released, and a depressing number of hands are raised in a lot of these audiences. So just as a little bit of background, maybe if you weren't tuned in 1992, or maybe responsible for the meal shopping or the meal prep or the grocery shopping for your family in the early 90s, you may recall that there was a lot of concern that the nation was lapsing into an obesity epidemic. And so in 1992, the United States Department of Agriculture released this sort of ingenious little graphic that I still think is really clever, the food pyramid. And the idea was that from bottom to top, that it would help us to rank, give us a rank order of the food groups from the best for us to the maybe worst for us at the top. And then if you think about the pyramid sort of horizontally, the big broad base is not only home to the foods that are healthiest for us, but then therefore also the ones that we ought to be looking at eating in the greatest proportion. Whereas the foods that are worse for us up at that slender little tippy top of the pyramid, maybe the ones that we need to eat very sparingly, or if we partake in them at all. So I'm going to ask you. We have a small enough group that I can just ask you to unmute if you have some volunteers. Knowing what you know today, maybe not what you know about the food pyramid, but if I were to ask you as your 2026 self, what would you put at the base of the pyramid as the food group that is healthiest for us?
Fruits and vegetables.
Fruits and veggies.
Fruits and veggies. That is sort of universally the answer that I get here. How about at the tippy top? What are the foods that maybe you would classify as the least good for us, the least healthy?
Sugar,
refined
Fats.
carbohydrates. Well,
certain fats.
certain fats. All right, I like that clarification. Let me share with you what the USDA put forward in 1992, and it may surprise you. The foods that were encouraged as the foundation of a healthy diet at 6 to 11 servings per day were bread, cereal, rice, and pasta. Those very refined carbohydrates that we were just talking about putting up at the tippy top of the pyramid. Maybe our first hint here should have been that this was the U.S. Department of Agriculture that released this, and not the Department of Health and Human Services. At the top of the pyramid, though, were fats and sweets, and I'll fill in the rest quickly to show you sort of the full breadth of the food pyramid. It's interesting to note, as Stacy mentioned, even then we had, we knew that there were some substantial shades of gray here, right? We know that there are carbohydrates that are highly refined, that process very quickly in the body and are, kind of quickly converted to fat. We also know that, when it comes to fats, that there are fats that are not so great for us, saturated fats, not maybe so great, but we also have unsaturated fats like in olive oil or avocado that we don't even much call unsaturated at this point. We call them heart healthy fats in a lot of cases. And so this is the pyramid. Those shades of gray sort of got lost in the mix in a lot of ways. I think as they were looking for kind of a short, pithy way of putting this forward to the American public, the translation became fat is bad and carbohydrates are good. Do you recall Slim Fast, those shakes, right? They used to market them and say as a diet tool, they were fat free, but they were loaded with carbohydrates, which would give you energy. Which was a polite way of saying they were full of sugar. So that was the food pyramid in 1992, which then I can show you some of if you weren't around, some of the health foods of the early 1990s, our low-fat Twinkies, our Snackwell's cookies, if you remember those. If you were too young to, the Snackwell's cookies you couldn't even buy because they were so popular. Bottom line was that the food pyramid sort of launched this multi-billion-dollar low-fat and no-fat food industry that in hindsight is actually credited with exacerbating the very obesity epidemic that the food pyramid was introduced to resolve. It's kind of shocking to think, if you were to go to a nutritionist, a credible nutritionist here in the year 2026, and they said to you, if you really want to watch your weight, the foundation of that would 11 servings of pasta a day, for example, is a little surprising. So surprising that in 2008, the Harvard School of Public Health, the T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard, released a revision of the food pyramid. They called it the healthy eating pyramid. And actually, this is great because we're on Zoom and you can actually see this graphic. This is harder to see, but if you'll notice. A couple of things have happened in this revised graphic. First, there's a new base that actually emphasizes a lot of lifestyle choices, exercise and portion control. But if you sort of disregard that new base and look just at where they have put the foods, what you'll notice is that they haven't just changed the food pyramid. In some ways, they've inverted it. Right, that those refined sugars that used to be at the base of the pyramid are now right up at the tippy top of the pyramid, whereas the fats that were discouraged, things like avocado and olive oil and almonds that were a no-no in the early 1990s are now a part of the base. Things have changed very dramatically. And so I sort of begin the book and begin our conversation on this point because I think it sort of prompts a scary question for us, which is where else in our public policy might we be getting things catastrophically wrong in this moment? Where might we 35 years from now look back at the year 2026 and sort of chuckle in the way that we can at the food pyramid and sort of marvel at how we ever thought the way that we did. And the book makes the case, as I will make to you, that there is no place that we are more backward, more upside down, more in need of an inversion in our thinking than in our approach to young children and families in this country. I don't know if you're a comic book fan. I'm not a super big comic book nerd, but I can tell you that I know from my childhood that in the world of Superman, there was the Bizarro world, right, where everything was sort of the opposite of the way that it should be. The Earth is a sphere. You can see here the Bizarro world is a cube. Day is night and up is down. And there was even a Superman in the Bizarro world, except instead of being a hero, he was a villain. Right, and everything was backward. And so the book makes the case that we have created, I hope very much inadvertently, a kind of bizarro world for children. And let me give you an example of that. We know, for example, that during the very weeks and months that are most important to newborn babies to develop secure attachment with their parents. We know that 1 in 4 American mothers are forced to return to the workforce within 2 weeks of giving birth. Isn't that shocking? I think we don't think a lot about that. I shared that all across the UK around this time last year, and there was always a gasp in the audience to hear that. And I had to say, that's not necessarily the norm. That there are definitely families that have much more robust forms of paid family leave. But at the same time, if your job is handing French fries through a window, chances are very good that you're not going to be taking 6 months of paid leave when you have a baby. Bizarro world for children. I'll highlight some of the other aspects of that. But the bottom line is that we have things very backward in terms of comparing what we know about the needs of very young children and how we treat them in society. Which brings us then to the title of the book, The Daycare Myth. And the myth in question is that we have sort of created this false dichotomy in which there is this place that we hold in great reverence, and it's a place where children go at age 5 to begin learning, and we call that place school. But that for young children, that we have something that we consider to be much lesser, and we call that daycare or childcare. And we think of it as being sort of wholly separate and distinct from education in ways that we know, through decades of research now, is just not the case. In fact, we understand better than we ever have the importance of the period from prenatal to 3, and in ways that that arguably make our early childhood classrooms in what we may call daycare or childcare perhaps the most important learning environments in our lifetime. Because of the important growth and development that is happening during that time. So the daycare myth is this idea that we have allowed the public and in many cases policymakers to sort of think of the early childhood years in a way that is not supported by science, that it is sort of a form of industrialized babysitting. I hate to equate it sort of like to a kennel, but if you if you look at the way that states are approaching things like childcare licensing, it's hard not to make that comparison in some cases when they say, well, what if we just allowed, a few more babies into each classroom? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's sort of the daycare myth. That we have a kind of a crisis of understanding amongst the public. We also know that this leads then to an economic crisis within the field. We know that that childcare is sort of a broken 3-legged stool. We know that that parents are paying more for infant care in most states at this point than they would be paying for in-state college tuition. Or for housing, which is a little shocking in the sense that when you are expecting a baby, one of the very first things obviously that people sort of advise you to do is start a college savings account, because we know that it is so costly that even saving for 17 years may not be sufficient to fully cover that cost. What we don't talk enough about is the fact that families incur that same cost instantly when they have a baby, and that comes either in the form of tuition to an out-of-home program, which can be incredibly costly, or in some cases it comes as what economists would call an opportunity cost. Maybe one parent has to leave the workforce entirely. And that income is lost to the family. So we know that it is incredibly costly to families, more so than they can realistically pay. At the same time, we think about if as expensive as it is, I see this online all the time. As expensive as childcare is, you would assume that the owners of these businesses would be just raking in the cash, hand over fist. And we know in reality that that's not true either, that many of these businesses are struggling mightily to even keep their doors open. A recent analysis from the Minneapolis Fed estimated that many of these businesses operate on less than a 1% profit margin, and that's because childcare is just incredibly costly to provide. It's very labor intensive. You need the overhead of lots of space. It's particularly infant toddler care is almost almost impossible to provide at a profit or really even at a break even. I think of it very much as like the loss leader kind of things that we see on Black Friday before the holidays, right? Where there's a big screen TV for $40 or something, and they're taking a loss on that thing, but they're hoping that you're going to come in and spend money on other things that'll be more profitable, and that is the case in the losses incurred in the infant toddler space are offset barely by service to slightly older preschoolers, 3 and 4-year-olds who can be served in a little bit larger group. So parents are paying more than they reasonably can. Providers are not making, really not turning a profit in this space. And the whole sad affair is sort of cobbled together and subsidized on the backs of a low income workforce that is almost exclusively female. I mean, 99% plus, and in many states, majority women of color. So that is the three-legged stool. Let me tell you a quick story about how bad is it when it comes to the compensation question. I had the good fortune a couple of years ago in my work at the Hunt Institute to be doing some work with the state of Kansas. Governor Laura Kelly, I don't know if you've followed this at all, but in recent years has successfully worked with the legislature to create an early childhood agency for the state. That was a multi-year process that will consolidate all of the state's early childhood services under one roof. And as part of that process, about 2-3 years ago, I was in Kansas and we did a listening tour around the state. We traveled around to, I think, 9 cities in 4 days. It was quite a whirlwind week. But we went to community centers and churches and libraries and convened people to talk about the system. And I was in a rural community in Kansas, sitting at a table of I think 6 or 7 people at a round table, hearing about their needs in the community. And I noticed there was a woman sitting to my right who had been sort of happily nodding along the whole conversation, but hadn't said anything. And so I, and wearing my best facilitator hat, I decided I needed to try to bring her into the conversation before the hour was up. And so when there was a pause, I turned to her and said, "Hey, tell us your story, introduce yourself and, tell us about you." And so it turns out she was a childcare business owner in this rural community in Kansas. And I said, "Well, so great. Tell us what you need. What could the state do differently? What do you need to serve well the children and families and your employees?" And she said, "Oh, I know exactly what I need. I need a floating substitute." I don't know if that makes good sense to you, but a floating sub is just someone who maybe isn't assigned to a particular classroom, who has the ability to kind of flexibly go in and out of a number of classrooms so that a teacher can take a phone call or use the restroom or what have you. And I said, "Oh, like so that your teachers could have a lunch to themselves occasionally?" And she said, "No, actually, we pretty well have that covered." And then I was really kind of puzzled. I said, "Well, so why, what do you need a floating sub for?" She said, "Well, I really have to prioritize every week making sure that I can let my teachers go to the bank." And then I was really puzzled, honestly, because I think about my own life, the number of times now with banking apps and direct deposit and all of that. I mean, I can probably count on one hand the number of times I've set foot physically in a bank in recent years. And so I said, so to deposit their paychecks? And she said, "No, not that kind of bank." And I'll tell you, I have trouble telling this story. She explained that she was very concerned that she was not able to pay the women who worked for her enough to put food on the tables for their own families. And that there was a church in the community that ran a food bank as a ministry to the less fortunate. And in this case, the less fortunate were her own teachers, her full-time employees, who have, sacrificed to help build the brains of other children who are, experiencing food scarcity. That's how bad the situation is. If you look at this this particular graph, and this is now actually a couple of years old, but it is data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that was released during COVID. At the time, the median pay for a child care worker, so think of an infant toddler teacher in the country, was $13.22 an hour, or 59 cents an hour less than we pay dog walkers, according to that same set of data. So again, a bizarro world for children, that during the most important period of their development, that this is the way we value the adults who are helping to teach them in this context. So the book lays out, just as sort of the reason that I shared the food pyramid, we have created sort of my own version of an early childhood policy pyramid, which I won't read to you because you can see it on the screen, but it is sort of grounded in the idea that we misunderstand the early years as a time that requires sort of simple custodial care, rather than sort of nurturing that would optimize the development of young children. That it is inaccessible, it is unaffordable, it is unprofitable, it is premised on the low wages of women, and up at the tippy top, the thing that we have the least of is quality. Right? Ironically enough, that there are two groups of people in this country who have a reasonable expectation that they may be able to find quality early childhood programs. One are the very wealthy, right? The people who can really pay a premium cost to get what their children need. Strangely enough, the other end of the spectrum, the very low income, is the other group, and that is primarily a function of Head Start, right? That that families that are deeply impoverished, may have the ability to enroll their children in a very high quality program funded by the federal government. But between those two extremes are a lot of families who are caught in the middle. This is all premised in large part on the question that I hear from policymakers all the time. It's funny, the rationale, if there is one for early childhood, is that they are constantly saying to me, we want our children to come to kindergarten ready to learn. Let me pause on that and let you think about that sentence for a minute, right? We want them to come to school at age 5, ready to learn, as though that is when learning begins. And we know better than we ever have that that is just not the case. So here, you can unmute and holler out, your pop quiz here. If it doesn't begin in kindergarten, when does learning begin?
In the womb.
Yeah.
In the womb? Anyone have a different answer? I tend to get two or three different answers, but primarily, the answers that I get, which are both really solid, A answers, if I were grading them, are, from day one, right? The children enter the world learning. And then, and that's a solid A answer, but the A plus answer, not surprisingly, coming from Stacy, is that, we understand better than we ever have the ways that young children are beginning to learn in utero. And it is the most fascinating, to me, the most fascinating part of our emerging understanding of early development. It raises kind of an interesting question around, when exactly does consciousness begin in the womb? And the answer there is a kind of a complex one. Scientists haven't exactly come to consensus on what the word consciousness even means. But when it comes to something like basic sensory perception, that we begin using our five senses to learn about the world, that answer is much more clear. At about 24 to 26 weeks of gestation, something sort of magical happens in the brain. We call it thalamocortical connectivity. You don't need to remember that word necessarily, but what that means is that the nerve fibers that connect the key structures in the brain to enable the senses are kind of fully wired and connected to one another. It's funny, if I were to ask you, when hearing begins in utero, you might say, oh, well, it begins when we have functional ears, and that makes good sense. But we have to bear in mind that it's not just our sensory organs that enable us to experience the world. It is structures in our brain that help to sort of interpret the data that our sensory organs. So by 24, 26 weeks, we have not only basically functioning sensory organs, but the wiring in the brain to start making sense of some of that experience. And so our very first learning arguably comes along with our very first sounds. And so somewhere, late second trimester, early third trimester, children begin hearing in utero. And what they, arguably the first thing that that any of us ever experienced is the sound of our mother's heartbeat. Maybe the sound of some of her digestive rumblings. But shortly thereafter, we are introduced then to the tone of her voice. And not only that, but to the rhythms and the patterns of her native language. We're not, as best we know at this point, not really picking up on meaning. We're not learning vocabulary, for example, in utero, but we are picking up on sort of the distinct sound of our mother's voice and what speech therapists would call the prosody of her language, the sort of unique musicality of your native language. And it is fascinating. If we had more time, I could go into great detail here. My next book actually gets into this in a lot of detail. Bottom line is that as measured both in utero and in the hours immediately after birth, we have evidence that young children can distinguish their mother's voice from that of a stranger, can distinguish and prefer the sound of her native language to those of foreign languages, even that they are soothed preferentially by music that is introduced during gestation. And so here I promised that there would be some baby videos. This is, and hopefully you'll be able to hear this, I think I set the settings correctly. This is a dad and a big sister who our mom here is expecting twins. You'll be able to see that if you watch her belly. It moves very vigorously toward the end of this video. And this is dad and big sister having an early conversation with the babies, and watch how they react.
Talk to the babies. They moved.
Are you able to hear that?
They're moving. Look. Say hello to them. Hello, baby.
Hello, baby.
Hello, little ones. Hello.
Wow.
Say I love you.
Hello.
Oh. Hello.
Hello.
Isn't that lovely? But that's a great illustration of one of the ways that we have tracked and sort of assess whether children are hearing is through that fetal movement that is happening. I'll show you one more quick one here, and then got a couple more videos later on. This is a very sweet, maybe one of my favorite videos that I have ever shared on social media. I don't know if you all are familiar. We didn't really discuss it, but I have a pretty large social media presence, sharing sort of developmental examples and videos. And so this is one of the favorite ones that I have ever shared. This is a little boy whose name is Everest, and he is meeting his little sister Avalon for the very first time. In the maternity ward. So it's their very first face-to-face meeting, but if you listen carefully, I think you'll recognize that maybe it's not their first conversation, in the sense that we just saw in that last video. Watch here.
Hi, Mommy. Hi, Avalon. It's me, Everest. It's me, Everest.
It's your little sister.
I'm your big brother.
Oh my God. You couldn't have written this any better. Oh, just be very gentle, huh?
I love you, Avalon. She's so lucky to have me.
She's very, very lucky to have her.
You want to?
Yeah, she's your baby too.
Okay, you can't have her. Okay, why don't you sit down and I'll bring her over. Now, we want to be very gentle, so I'm going to tell you how to hold her, okay? Very gentle. So put your arms out. Okay, put you.
Hey, love you, Avalon.
It was right. As a dad, that one always gets me. I will tell you, I expanded so I could watch your faces during this video. It's become kind of a favorite game of mine as I speak around the country. I'll tell you a quick story. About a year ago, I was in Bath, England, at a place called Norland College. If that rings a bell, Norland is arguably the oldest sort of dedicated college just for early childhood development, and it is home to what they call the Norland Nannies, which is the primarily young women who have trained, and if you think of Mary Poppins or the nannies that go on to work with the royal family, for example, they all come from this Norland College. And I showed this video to them, and I had to stop speaking for about 4 minutes while they all cried. It was a lovely experience. They had to pass out tissues. I told them I thought they were going into the right profession, maybe. But what's lovely about this video, do you see what I meant when I said maybe it wasn't their first conversation, right? How Everest comes into the room and it's me, Everest. Like I bet you've been wondering what I look like this whole time, like maybe somebody you've only met over Zoom. So maybe not their first ever conversation. And what is lovely about this video as well is the way that the parent's voice that comes out. We know that for preschoolers that welcoming a new sibling can be kind of a stressful experience in a lot of cases, and so you can just imagine. I don't know if you caught, it's a little bit buried in the vocals here, but when he says she's so lucky to have me. Right. And you can just imagine where that came from, right? That, that mom and dad over and over, for months have been saying to him, you're going to be such a great big brother. You're going to have so much to teach her. She's going to be so lucky to have you as a big brother. And so lovely to see that sort of that connection. There are a couple of different ways we know that babies are listening and learning in utero. Again, we've got these studies that show, that they react and prefer their mother's voice. A fascinating study actually done in the late 80s on babies that were just hours old. They concocted sort of an electronic pacifier that measured the rate at which these babies were sucking on the pacifier. They created sort of, established what the baseline rate of sucking was, and then they introduced an experiment. If the baby started sucking faster than normal, it would activate a recording of their own mother's voice reading a story. And if they sucked more slowly than usual, it would activate the same reading, but delivered by a stranger. And what they found was that even in the first hours of life, that babies adjusted their behaviors, that they learned what they needed to do to activate their mother's voice, that preferred voice that they had been listening to for so many months in utero. They brought those kids back the next day, and sort of reversed the situation. This time they had to suck more slowly to hear their mom, and 100% of the babies in this study were able to adjust their behavior to activate their mother's voice, so that preferred sound. Similar studies on native language. We're, in the interest of time, I'm not going to get deep into that. But we know, and I mentioned that, we also recognize and soothe to music that is introduced in utero. Fascinating study in Finland where they asked expectant moms to play the lullaby "Twinkle Twinkle Little Star" every day, a couple of times during the third trimester of pregnancy. What they found was that once those babies were born, that they soothed preferentially in comparison to a group that hadn't heard that song. They soothed preferentially sound, and when they played, they did brain scans where they played "Twinkle Twinkle Little Star," but they inserted a wrong note here and there, and they found that the brain activity was such that they could tell sort of that was a violation of what the babies were expecting was going to come in the song. It's just fascinating. It is not, by the way, just the lullabies that make their way in utero. Popular music makes its way in there as well. This is a mom who, by her own admission, listened to a lot of music by the rapper Lil Jon during her third trimester. And get a load of this. What you're going to see in this video is a very fussy baby crying in the opening seconds. Mom asks Alexa, the Amazon device, to play this song that she had played over and over. You may recall is a very famous song called "Get Low." And so she asks Alexa to play "Get Low," and watch how the baby reacts.
Alexa, play "Get Low."
Isn't that fantastic? People frequently ask me if I think that mom's movement had anything to do with that, and I certainly do. But what has fascinated me about this video since the first time I saw it was the way that child immediately locks in, stops crying, and if it's possible to maintain eye contact with a song, this little one manages to do it. Is really sort of laser focused on the direction where that music, that familiar song is coming from. So a lot of emerging evidence around learning in utero. That children come into the world already recognizing so much. We know if you've been around early childhood for any period of time, this graph is probably familiar to you. It's from a book called Neurons to Neighborhoods that was published back around the year 2000. And it is a timeline over which the major neural connections in the brain are wired. And if you sort of focus in on that pink box on the screen, that's the first 12 months of life, kind of a zoom in on the months there, as opposed to the years further down the timeline. And what you'll see is that those, the primary neural connections, first for our senses, next for language, then for higher cognitive functions, all are primarily wired during the first 12 months of life. And each of those curves, you'll notice, is already in a period of a steep decline by the end of the first 12 months. What's fascinating about this graphic when I share this with policymakers is that in most parts of the United States, kindergarten, 5-year-old kindergarten, is really the first guaranteed early childhood experience in this country. In most states, frankly, there are a couple of states where even that is even that is questionable. But the interesting thing to note here is that this important wiring of the brain happens not only before kindergarten or before pre-K, but years before children ever set foot into a public school classroom setting. And I think that's a really important recognition for this group too, as you go forward and make some of your choices. In the interest of time, I'm going to go quickly through some of these other things, but I want to just illustrate again sort of the experience of infants and how they are learning through their interactions as they come into the world. So, frequently we talk about, when a baby is on the way, we use the word expectant, right? That you're an expectant mom or expectant parents. But I'm fond of pointing out that parents aren't the only ones who are expectant, that babies come into the world expectant of certain things, expectant of love and attention and nurture. And so this is a pretty long video. I'll only show you maybe a couple seconds and then we'll move on. You'll get the point here quickly, but look at this expectant little one. So this video goes on for about, 90 more seconds or so, and over and over and over. Anytime mom sort of looks in the direction of her own dinner, baby is there to sort of lean over and say, hey, remember me? And, tries to draw her attention in. There's a reason for that. Not only is this an important part of attachment, but it is an important part of learning, that babies are particularly well attuned to the faces of their primary caregivers, and that, for babies, that our faces are very much like Google in the sense that they learn lots of different things. In fact, lots of things that maybe you wouldn't expect from that up-close, one-on-one interaction with a caring adult. One of those things is that they engage in what we call serve and return. So they, this is up close, back and forth, serve and return. The term comes from tennis, the sort of, hitting the ball back and forth over the net. So this is a turn-taking game where adults and babies sort of mirror and extend the language and the facial expressions and the movements of the other. Here's a dad and his newborn daughter engaging in some serve and return.
Ooh. Ooh. Oh my God. Ooh.
I always wish that one would go on a little bit longer. I'd love to see how that plays out. Another thing that is really crucial, and I always want to sort of point out to policymakers. It's funny, in this country, we are spending hundreds of millions of dollars across the country here in recent years, creating what we call third grade reading initiatives, right? Our third grade reading laws, where children don't advance to the fourth grade if they aren't proficient. There is very seldom in these conversations a recognition as to the foundational effects of the very earliest years and months on language development, for example, which is so critical in undergirding later literacy development. Watch this little one. This baby is going to say over and over, or the mom rather is going to say over and over one word. She's going to say the word hi. And you can even see it as you say hi, your mouth opens kind of nice and wide. So he is watching his mom. Mom's going to say hi. Baby is not going to say hi exactly. But if you watch, baby doesn't have the articulation piece of this puzzle down yet to actually say hi. But if you watch his mouth, he very clearly is saying hi. He's mimicking what mom is doing with her mouth, watching her lips, watching her mouth move, and then trying to do very much the same thing. So watch, sometimes you'll hear a sound come out, sometimes not, but he is really working hard to do exactly what mom is doing. So watch.
Oh, somebody's saying hi. Your mommy's boy. Your mommy's boy.
Say hi again.
Hi. Hi.
Oh, he's really trying.
Could you see him saying hi there? Pretty amazing. Let's jump ahead to a slightly older baby. Dad's gonna say, "I love you." And baby's not exactly going to say "I love you," but if you listen very carefully to the first thing she does say, you might be surprised by how closely actually it does sort of mimic at least the sort of rhythm and pattern of "I love you."
I love you. Yeah. Wow.
And we'll go a little bit older still here.
I love you. 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 Say, I love you.
So fascinating to watch how that progresses over time, but recognize again the incredible language development that is happening during the first year. The other thing that happens, and in the interest of time, I think maybe I'm going to skip this one and go to the next one, but just as a gauge, the other thing that babies do is that they are looking at our faces to gauge their own safety and our moods, right? If you are, as a new parent, having a stressful day and feeling maybe a little cranky yourself, don't be surprised if your baby mirrors that right back to you. But they're also watching carefully, and so got a couple of videos. I'm going to jump ahead of this one and show you the next. But this is a little guy who is on his very first plane trip. And this is the moment at which the plane lands, that bump when the plane sort of hits the runway. And he's not quite sure what to think of that. Not surprisingly, I think even a lot of us as adults are sometimes not quite sure what to think of plane landings. But watch what he does. Watch how he uses his parents' faces as a reference to, am I okay? Is this safe? Is this fun? What's going on? There's the bump. So arguably a scary experience, something new that could have been something that upset the child. Takes the time. He checks mom's face, checks dad's face. They're both smiling. They seem to be okay with this, and therefore, I am okay too. So, what what I've been doing, my devious plan here. Is not just showing you cute baby videos. It is sort of establishing and illustrating what I set up in the book as the three major lessons across decades of child development research here. I call them the three simple truths of early development. And those are things that we've all talked about now. First, that learning begins in utero and never stops. Second, that the period from prenatal to 3 is a uniquely consequential window in the development of the human brain. It is when the fundamental architecture of our brains that will help to either support or hinder our success in life is formed. And the third is that optimal development is highly dependent on stable, nurturing relationships with highly engaged adults. Those truths probably don't strike anybody in the group as being terribly newsworthy or revolutionary, but I want to challenge you to think a little bit about the way our systems for young children work. And I would argue to you that we have systems that are very poorly equipped to sort of build on these three simple truths of development. And the implications are really pretty huge. First, to this idea of the daycare myth that, that learning happens in school beginning at age 5, but that, that the earliest years are primarily just for kind of custodial caregiving. This, those truths turn, with those videos we've been looking at, turn that whole idea on its head, right? What we know is that all environments for young children are learning environments, all of them. The question is, are they any good? And that is, a place that in many children's cases, unfortunately, the answer is no. So, the other, big takeaway here is how much the early childhood workforce matters. Those people that, that we barely train, that we pay $13.22 an hour, the people that turn over at a rate of 40% or more a year out of the profession, are incredibly important to the success of our children. Arguably, again, as important, if not more so, than teachers in our K-12 or our higher ed systems in terms of setting us up for lifelong success. The other, sort of big policy implication here is that things like ratios and group sizes that are, that are considered as part of childcare policy matter in a way that, that we never, never much give credit for. I don't know how many, let's see if I can see the group here. How many of you are parents in the group? Fair number of you by show of hands. All right, how many of you are parents of quadruplets? Anyone? No. It's funny. I every time I ask this in a large group, I get sort of the same response, which is kind of a nervous laugh, which is almost as if to say, like, there but for the grace of God go I, that I am not the parent of quadruplets. And the reason for that actually makes great sense, right? Anyone who has ever tried to take care of a newborn baby knows how all-consuming and exhausting it is to meet the needs of even one child. And so the idea of trying to care for 4 of them simultaneously is a very a very scary proposition in a lot of ways. And I raise that in part to say, we recognize that on an individual basis, but when it comes to childcare in this country, a ratio of 4 to 1, the equivalent of being the mother of quadruplets, is actually the gold standard in terms of quality. That if you have a program that has an infant ratio of 4 to 1, that is, along with many other things, what gets you nationally accredited, as a top quality program in the country. Group sizes also, and I think that, the question here is, could you reasonably, again, circling back to those videos about the babies watching faces and serve and return interactions, could you reasonably provide that level of attention to 4 children at once? And then, the question in many states, because of the economics and the challenges that the childcare industry is facing, there are states that are saying, well, what if we tried to help programs by just allowing 2 more babies in the classroom, right? And so now we're in a position of looking at something like 6 to 1. Could you even, provide basic health and safety for 6 newborns simultaneously? I'm doubtful, but for the sake of argument, let's say, okay, maybe you could get away with, just sort of, changing diapers, feeding, and making sure that they're literally safe until their parents come back. Maybe you could accomplish that, but could you accomplish the kind of learning that those children we were just looking at are engaged with? I would have to argue that you could not. That is why the choice of an early childhood setting, the message that I'm consistently giving to parents is that your choice as to where who is spending their days with your baby. Whether it's you, whether it's somebody in an out-of-home program, is arguably the most important choice you will ever make for your child. And the reason for that is that we are, again, not selecting a babysitter. I mean, you are literally selecting the adults who will help to co-construct your child's brain, with very long-lasting consequences. And that's a very different way of looking at the challenges of our system. The implications, in terms of what we're doing for young kids are really huge. The question then comes to, who's paying the cost? It's interesting that I talk with policymakers about this a lot. First off, the quick answer to who pays the cost is every one of us. Whether you have a young child in your life or not, the implications here are very huge. And that's because we know that children who get off to the right start, have better health outcomes later in life. They have better education outcomes. They are less likely to access costly social services in adulthood. They are less likely to have interactions with the criminal justice system. And so, the good news is that, policymakers increasingly, I feel like, are saying to me, I kind of get it now. I think we've done a reasonably good job of articulating the brain science. The question they have is, I just don't know how we pay for it. And my answer consistently is that we are already paying for the system we need for young children. We're just doing it in the dumbest possible ways. Right, that we seem content to build more prisons and to have worse education outcomes and to have, a spiraling Medicaid cost in our states that is resulting from poor health outcomes and more reliance on those social services. All things that we could mitigate against. In fact, this is a huge. I think a hugely appealing bipartisan argument. You may recall here, a year or so ago, Elon Musk was involved with the administration and this DOGE agency looking at, how to trim costs, and sort of right size the size of government and ideally limit the individual tax burden. And the answer is that there's a way to do this. There's a bipartisan way to do it. And it doesn't have to do with eliminating agencies. It has to do with making smart, proactive investments in kids. Just 2 or 3 more slides and then we'll pause here. If you had a financial advisor who came to you and said, I have this investment idea, it will yield you 13.1% annually, you would be insane not to take that, right? If you look at the chart on the left, you see the recent 30-year returns of the S&P 500, the Standard & Poor's 500, which is a stock index of the 500 largest companies in the country, and you'll see that in the past 30 years, it has averaged somewhere 7.5%, 8%. Over a 10-year period there, once we got a little over 10%, but 13.1% is the rate of return calculated by Jim Heckman. Jim Heckman is a Nobel Prize winning economist, previously of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank. Now he is a professor of economics at the University of Chicago, and he has dedicated most of his career to tracking the long-term rate of return from these high quality investments. And what he found is that the investments that we make earliest in life, beginning even prenatally, yield these incredible large returns to society. So as an investor, you'd be crazy to turn that down, but we as a nation are turning that down at scale, to the detriment of taxpayers all across the country. This is called the Heckman curve. The idea here is just that the rate of return is greatest the earliest you invest, and you see that begins to decrease as we get into even into the preschool years, but certainly then in K-12 and job training. It's interesting if we could overlay what we actually spend in this country, where we expend our resources, you'd see a curve that looks very different from this, that we spend a lot of money in K-12 and in higher ed and job training, and compared to the rest of the industrialized world, almost nothing on the years of infant toddler growth. I sort of went through this, so I'll just sort of broadly say we know that our high quality early childhood investments decrease a bunch of negative factors that we would love to see decrease, and at the same time they improve all the things that we would like to improve: academic achievement, health outcomes, stable marriages, tax-paying ability. In closing, it's a difficult conversation, though. A lot of what we talked about here in terms of health outcomes and interactions with the criminal justice system and things, those are costs that or savings rather that are incurred maybe over a period of several decades, right? And so for policymakers, it's sometimes a difficult conversation to say, hey, if we invest wisely now, 30 years from now, things are going to be very different. They aren't always, they don't always have the luxury of thinking on that long a timeline. But so, I think it's important then to point out that we also have data that shows the real-time benefits of these sorts of investments. My colleagues at a group called the Ready Nation did an amazing study about 2 years ago now, where they looked at the real-time cost of insufficient infant toddler care in this country. And you see on the screen there, the national kind of annual cost is $122 billion. Most of that borne by parents in the form of lost or foregone wages, but also by businesses whose productivity and profitability is diminished by the challenges that their employees are facing. And when parents aren't making the money they ought to be making, when businesses aren't making the money they would otherwise be making, then there is a loss of revenue into state and local tax coffers in a way that then burdens other taxpayers with sort of making up the difference. So that's the Ready Nation study. Interestingly, they break this down by state. Would you like to know how much North Carolina is losing every single year, according to this study? The answer is $3.5 billion. It's always funny as I talk to policymakers and they say, well, those early childhood advocates are, they want $50 million. And I say, well, are you aware that the state is losing $3.5 billion every year as a result of not getting this right? So, important that we keep in mind not only the long-term benefits, but also the real-time benefits. So won't surprise you in closing, the book sort of ends with a call that we, much like the food pyramid, need to invert our thinking and come to a new place where we have widespread public recognition of the early years as that critical window of development that shapes our long-term success, that it is a high-quality service available to all children, that it is delivered by a well-trained and professionally compensated workforce, and that up there at the tippy top, where currently the thing that happens least is quality. What we'd like to have happen least in the future is that we ever again confuse these incredibly important early years as a period of sort of simple, protective custodial care. So with that, I think that's the last slide I've got here today. So I will we'll pause and just say, again, we didn't talk a lot about specific policies, but I hope that gives you a lot to think about in terms of specific policies, because it's, that in my mind is a very policy heavy conversation. If we know these things, if we know that children are learning in utero instead of at age 5, if we know that having caring adults who are providing that up close, one-on-one kind of interaction is important. If we know that children need that time to bond with their families, all of these things have really profound implications for how we go forward in this country. The book gets into some of the solutions and pitfalls. I know that you are debating, in your context in Buncombe County, sort of how to invest going forward, some precious resources that you have to the betterment of children and families in Asheville. And so I hope that this has been kind of a helpful introduction. With that, I'm happy to take any questions or
Yeah,
also.
we'll do a quick time check. I was gonna see if Martin is back. I know he had to step away a little bit earlier in the call. He's juggling a couple of things simultaneously. So first of all, thank you. I think that your coverage of the why really hits home. We have about 5 minutes only for conversation, but we're in the process of finalizing the contract and making sure that we've got some time with you for follow-ups that we can dig more in together to the how. We don't have anyone currently signed up for public comment. We do have a couple of announcements that I want to hit before we close at 2:30. So time for a couple of brief questions and answers.
I just wanted to say thank you, Dan, so much for focusing so much on the infant to like 2 range, because that's my passion. And that's where a lot of, and I don't want to say this as a blanket statement, but there's a lot of abuse that goes on and lack of educating a child, because, there's just a lot of babies that just sit there at home with their grandparent, their aunt, their uncle. So thank you. To me, that meant a lot.
Thank you, Beth. I would say in addition to that, I mean, I think from a policy perspective, I guess, one question would be then, so what of pre-K? Right? I mean, if we, is that the solution? And it's funny, as I, over the past couple of decades, have worked with a lot of states who have made some very, very sizable investments in providing universal pre-K to all 4-year-olds. I think there's great evidence to suggest that that pre-K can be very impactful. But I think if I had a chance to design certain state systems all over again and was told, okay, we're gonna wipe the slate clean and we're gonna think about where we invest our money. I think what we know about the development of very young children maybe changes that equation a little bit in a way that forces us to think more about how things like paid family leave, for example, or the importance of really training and compensating well infant toddler teachers. All become very important parts of the policy conversation in a way that, frankly, that has not been the priority in recent years in most states.
Well, it also reminds me of when we were fighting teenage pregnancy. It was like, at what point do you enter that teen's life to try to prevent a teenage pregnancy? Well, at every point. It's not just one path to success. We have to hit this on the policy level. We have to hit this in the community education level of just educating parents. We have to go to the secondary schools with our community schools and trying to get more people who want to do this as a profession. And, and 40 other different things. We have to hit it from all sides. And I don't know that, which means I think we need to find a better way of collaborating with all the other entities that are involved. And sort of maybe one of the things we need to do is doing a mind map of who all is involved in deciding about our children who are in school or who need to be in some type of educational environment, and start from there, because it's not just the parent, it's not just the child care worker, it's not just the child care center owner, it's all kinds of dozens of different places. And like you said early on, if you got to be back at work 2 weeks after you give birth to that baby, oh my Lord, who knows who's taking care of your child? Though I will have to say, in the North Asheville Ingalls market, I am seeing parents talking to their kids constantly as they're rolling them down the path of the grocery store, which you didn't used to see, but they are nonsense talk sometimes, or just he or she's talking about whatever there's on their list. But, some of that's getting out there, you're seeing it in the general public, but I think we need to figure out how to work more collaboratively and not in these silos.
Thank you for chiming in, Stacy and Beth. And thank you again to Dan, to Dr. Worry for spending time with us today. It is not the first, it's yet another in our various conversations that this committee has been undertaking over the last year plus, as we think about how can we to borrow language from others, how to ensure we're putting our investment to highest and best use. And so to be continued. Before we wrap, Martin, do you want me to go through the announcements? I'm just going to continue unless I see you chiming in. Okay, so let me pull up my notes just real quick, everyone. Grant applications for fiscal year 27, our new FY that starts in July. Those grant applications are due February 20th at noon. Angeline has sent out scoring instructions to committee members, and you will be beginning your individual scoring shortly once those applications are in. And the deadline to complete your individual work is March 31st, which is a Tuesday, March 31st at noon. So you'll have about 6 weeks with those applications independently before we begin our group work at the April meeting. The parent survey, thank you to Adrian, to Joe, to Maya, to Jennifer, to Martin, and Sarah Kay for being on the engagement work group, the subgroup that we put together. We're just about ready to launch the survey that will be going out to the community to hear from parents of young children or parents who have recently had young children. Thank you to Dan for inspiration, so that we are not in fact rolling out a survey to only ask questions about childcare, but also about parenting. So trying to learn from parents whether or not they have sought out childcare for their young children and the reasons that inform that. If they are seeking childcare, what's important to them in finding a childcare that's great for their family. What barriers or challenges have they faced, which we know what a lot of those will be. And also what kind of parenting support have they or might they engage with, and how. So we're excited to gather that information through the survey. When it comes out within the next couple of days, we'll send it to y'all so this group can cascade it to your networks. So thank you for spreading the word. And before we hang up, I have a request. We would like 1 to 2 volunteers who would be willing to be on camera and meet up with our social media manager from the county next Monday or Tuesday and film a reel that we can put on our social media to promote the survey. So Beth is willing to be in a reel. Anyone else willing to go on camera and be on social media, encouraging?
Are you gonna give us a script, or are we talking off the tops as our little pea brains here?
I don't know that answer.
It will probably be interview questions that you will then answer from a prompt on camera.
Thank you, Samantha.
And we'll have access to those questions beforehand?
I can try to make that happen, yes. But
Okay.
at request, so you'll just have to let me know.
Okay, maybe, yeah. I'll do it, and then if you want to toss it, just toss it.
Okay, so we have Beth and Stacy. It doesn't have to stop at 2. Is there a third person that's interested in filming anything quick?
Depending on timing, I could do it, but it would have to be after like early morning on Monday.
Cool. So Joe, Beth, Stacy, we'll make sure your contacts get to the CAPE team, and they'll work on coordinating something. It's great to have 3 in case it doesn't work out for any one or more of you. Appreciate your willingness to do that. We want to really have great participation in our survey. So that is all.
One quick question. What is the delivery system for notifying organizations about our grant process?
I will follow up with you in response to that question. We try to be as thorough as we can. We still have another three weeks or so. And so if you have ideas for spreading the word further, we'd like to do that. I want to be responsive of time, confirm that we still don't have anyone on for public comment. Our next meeting will be March 3rd at 1 p.m. And thank you all for your participation today.